All right, so we are now recording, and I know that you don't need to really introduce Dr. Zarefsky to us because we have enjoyed many times learning with him, but just delighted that he's here with us again. And I don't take it for granted that he's here with us again and that we have the privilege of learning with him. So, David.
What do you mean? He said he was always going to do it.
Thank you, Helene.
Well, thank you very much, Marcy, and thank you for hosting this evening and moderating the Q&A when we get to that. And welcome everyone to the third session of Current Politics for this academic year. In case you're wondering why this session is remote only, it's that as of Monday morning, no one had signed up to attend in person. So if you had been planning to just show up in person without registering, let me encourage you in the future to register in advance. Even if you're members and there's no charge, we use the registration figures to determine the arrangements for holding the class and, among other things, whether we'll be hybrid or remote only. Since everyone here tonight appears to be a veteran of earlier sessions of this class, I'm going to forego my usual description of what the class is all about and why it's offered by a synagogue and so forth. And I want to start off tonight with something we don't do usually, and that's to talk about local politics. Normally our focus is national and international, but I want to begin with some comments about the Chicago mayoral election, which I prefaced by saying I'm not a resident of Chicago, and so I don't have the ego involvement in that election that I suspect I would if I were a Chicago resident. But just so we're all on the same page to start with, it is at least nominally a nonpartisan election. It has been since the late 90s, and the reason it was changed from a partisan to a nonpartisan election is that the Republican Party in Chicago had great difficulty in coming up with credible candidates. So the way it works is there's a primary election in effect. If anyone gets a majority, as Richard M. Daley did and Rahm Emanuel did when he was first elected, if anyone gets a majority, that's the end of the election. If no one gets a majority, as has happened in 2015, 2019, and 2023, if no one gets a majority, then there is a runoff election between the top two contenders. There were 9 candidates this time for the mayoralty of Chicago, and the results of the primary were that Paul Vallas led the field with 34%, Brandon Johnson was second with 20%, the incumbent Lori Lightfoot was third with 17%. Jesus Chuy Garcia was fourth with 15%, and the remaining 5 candidates were all in single digits. So as you can see, no one got a majority, which meant that there will be a runoff election, and it's scheduled for April 4th between the top 2 candidates, Paul Vallas and Brandon Johnson. Now, this election was a story of rags to riches and riches to rags. In the last election, in 2019, Paul Vallas came in 9th out of the then 14 candidates in the race. So he went from 9th to 1st. And in 2019, Lori Lightfoot, in the runoff against Terry Preckwinkle, carried all 50 wards of Chicago, and she went from 1st to 3rd, not even being eligible for the runoff. The national press interpreted these results as having national significance. And of course, any mayoral election in Chicago probably does have national significance. But the way the national press generally interpreted the results was to say, in effect, that Democrats had discovered the issue of crime, that this had been a Republican issue traditionally, but crime had gone up in the big cities during COVID, and particularly violent crime. And therefore, this was a wake-up call for Democrats to get serious about it in their policy platforms and proposals. That the rise in crime rates during COVID, on the one hand, led to the repudiation of Mayor Lightfoot, and on the other hand, gave Paul Vallas a shot in the arm because he had, in this campaign, unlike his previous campaigns, had really focused on the issue of the rise in crime and the need for more police. And he had the endorsement of the policemen's union, and he spoke about law and order. He was a moderate Democrat, moderate to conservative Democrat, but he was striking what had traditionally been Republican themes. And so the election the national press held was a warning to Democrats that they needed to get serious about the law and order issue, or it would be ceded to the Republicans. Now, it's my contention that that's an overly simple explanation. There's something to it. Surely there's something to it, particularly since crime became an issue in parts of the city where it previously had not, in some of the areas on the north side, for example. But other considerations include the prominence of racial identity voting in Chicago. Now, it's not determinative. As I said, Lightfoot 4 years ago carried all 50 wards, regardless of their racial composition. But Vallas was the only white candidate out of the 9 in the race. And so the argument went, well, naturally, he'll pick up most of the white vote, and that will get him into the runoff. Well, at least I don't know how the vote broke down by race. I don't know. I don't think there are any tabulations of that. The charge was made also that Vallas was a Republican in all but name, and therefore his popularity was a sign that Democrats who traditionally had controlled the big cities were in trouble. And the only Democrats that were winning were moderate Democrats like Eric Adams in New York. Then there was the argument that Lightfoot was rejected because she was abrasive and had a difficult personality. I don't doubt that she's abrasive and has a difficult personality, but this has not usually been grounds for rejection of candidates in Chicago elections, even female candidates like Jane Byrne, for example. It's not a gender issue particularly. So what kind of nuances are there in the results of the primary? Well, first of all, there are in Chicago roughly equal numbers of whites, blacks, and browns, about a third of each. So the issue in the runoff is coalition building. Who will take most of Garcia's votes from the primary is a key question. Will most of Lightfoot's votes go to Johnson just on racial identity? That's another question, and I suspect the answer is it's not that simple. Moreover, the primacy of the crime issue does not imply agreement on the appropriate solution. There have been consistently great differences between Vallas and Johnson regarding what to do about crime. Johnson has argued for putting more money into mental health and social services. Vallas has argued for putting more money into police and law enforcement. Johnson has resisted putting more money into police and law enforcement. Vallas has not talked much about putting more into mental health and social services. But the ascendancy of the moderate Democrat, which is what Vallas really is, the ascendancy of the modern Democrat and the skepticism about progressives in the cities mirrors the pattern in New York City and Los Angeles. And a special concern is for Democrats to try to hold on to the urban blue-collar vote, which has traditionally been one of their sources of strength. As for the results of the April 4th election in Chicago, I will not hazard a guess. And that's not just my normal reluctance to do so. It's the fact that I don't know enough about the nuances of Chicago politics. I think the election will be close. And I think the question will, the outcome will turn on how Lightfoot and Garcia's votes from the primary divide themselves up. That's all I want to say about Chicago politics. I can try to answer questions later if you have some. But I want to turn now to a topic that is of, I suspect, great concern to many of us, and about which a number of you probably know more than I do. But I want to talk about it anyway, and that's the current situation in Israel. I'll begin by saying, for those who don't know much at all about it, there was a pretty good summary of the situation and the competing positions in the New York Times a week ago Saturday, or no, I'm sorry, last Saturday, March 11th, in the front section of the Times. But let's begin with some background information. Israel, like Great Britain, does not have a written constitution. That is less significant than it seems, because the United States, which does have a written constitution, that constitution doesn't say anything about judicial review. And the question that's at the root of the conflict in Israel is the locus of sovereignty of review. So in the US, when there's no basis for judicial review, how did it come about? Well, it came about, as you may remember from Civics 101, in the case of Marbury versus Madison in 1803, when Chief Justice John Marshall did something that was very shrewd. He made a ruling that the judiciary lacked power to enforce what should be enforced. In other words, he said Marbury had a claim to the writ of mandamus, but the court was powerless to order it. So he makes a decision expressing judicial supremacy by saying that in this case, the courts don't have the power to carry it out. Well, it was the credibility of the court that sustained judicial review. It was contested in the 1850s in the Dred Scott case, but it's been well established and consensually held that the right of interpretation of laws and the judgment of the acceptability of laws, and in the case of the US, the constitutionality of the laws, rests with the court. Now in Israel, an act of the Knesset in 1992 essentially established judicial review. A parliamentary act gave to the courts the power to interpret and to judge legislation. And it thereby established a check and balance on the parliamentary system. In the parliamentary system, the executive and legislative branches are not separate, they're intertwined. So the only check on their actions came from the courts. Now, not having a written constitution, the courts could not decide that laws were unconstitutional. But what they substituted for that was a judgment that a law was adamantly unreasonable. It was flagrant unreasonability was the standard that they used. Now, this didn't matter a whole lot for a while, because for a long time, the court tended to uphold the government. But as the government moved toward the right, the court began to challenge the government. And on about 20 occasions since 1992, has held a law passed by the Knesset to be flagrantly unreasonable and therefore unacceptable. The last case of this was whether Prime Minister Netanyahu could appoint a minister who was, I think, convicted of corruption. And the court said he could not. That was was flagrantly unreasonable. So what factors weakened the widespread perceived legitimacy of the court? Well, in a general sense, there was first of all the failure of the peace process in the early 1990s, the Oslo Accords not leading anywhere. And this caused some falling off of support and trust for the leaders of the institutions that were involved in the peace process, including the justices of the court. But there were two specific groups of the Israeli population that became increasingly alienated from the court. One was the settlers of the West Bank and Gaza, and the supporters of those settlements. You may remember that the Israeli government decided in 2005 unilaterally to withdraw from Gaza and to order settlers to leave from settlements that they had established in Gaza. Now, the Supreme Court had generally upheld the expansion of settlements, but it upheld the government in its decision to withdraw from Gaza. And the result was people began to challenge the supremacy of judicial review. Who's the court? Who told the court to make this decision? And the other group that has become more alienated from the court is the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim. In the early years of the state, special privileges were granted to the ultra-Orthodox, including most prominently the exemption from otherwise compulsory military service. The Supreme Court in 2012 overruled that exemption. Now, the Supreme Court decision has not been enforced in the 10 years since 2012, but nevertheless, that has turned off many of the Haredim to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. And so what's happened is in recent years, there's been an attack on the Supreme Court, and it didn't succeed because there wasn't a majority in the Knesset. When Netanyahu even was previously in power, his coalition required him to make alliances with moderates who would not support reducing the powers of the Supreme Court. But in the most recent election, he built his coalition from right-wing and ultra-Orthodox groups and had a majority in the Knesset to significantly alter the nature of judicial review. Now, before I talk about what the proposed alterations are, let me say a little something about the grounds on which the Netanyahu coalition has attacked the Supreme Court. The primary one is to say that the court is not democratic, that it's decision-making by elites rather than by elected officials. And that's not democratic. Now, I want to ignore for a minute the fact that public opinion polls suggest that a majority of the Israeli population does not support these proposed court reforms, and make the point that by their nature, court decisions which limit state power or expand individual rights are not democratic. They're not intended to be democratic. They rest on the assumption that there are some fundamental values that are so important to protect that they transcend democracy. And that's the case in the United States, for example, with the items in the Bill of Rights. They're seen as so fundamental that they outweigh democracy in the hierarchy of values. So this claim that the Supreme Court is not democratic doesn't carry much weight with those who don't already believe it. But even more, there are many different ways to conceive of democracy. The attack on the court assumes democracy is populist, That is, it's a direct reflection of public opinion. The defenders of the current system sometimes claim that the current system is democratic, by which they mean it's governed by the rule of law and is executed through institutions. When President Biden in the midterm elections said our democracy is under attack, that's the view of democracy that he was referring to. One that is law-governed, rule-oriented, based on majority rule plus minority rights, and that assumes that no decision is ever final, that it can always be relitigated. So the defense of the Supreme Court has been, it's the only check and balance we have on the actions of the Knesset. Hence, if we take that away, then we have no check and balance. It's the only thing that preserves the rule of law. Now, the current government, shortly after it came to power, proposed making 3 basic changes in the current powers of the Supreme Court. One was to change the way in which the justices of the Supreme Court are chosen. They're not chosen the same way they are in the US. They're chosen as a result of recommendations by a nonpartisan legal commission. So they're not put on the court with the assumption that they'll advocate a particular point of view or theory of the law. So the proposal was to change that and give the government substantially more role in the appointment of justices. Second, they proposed to eliminate extreme unreasonability as a grounds for overturning laws passed by the Knesset. And the argument is it's arbitrary, it's whimsical, you can't tell what it means, it doesn't lead to consistent standards, and so on. And the third thing is they proposed that a decision by the Supreme Court could be overturned by a bare majority of the Knesset, by 61 votes in the Knesset. Those are the 3 changes that they proposed to make. Israeli laws require 3 readings and positive votes in the Knesset. Now, this package has had 1 reading already, and its proponents are suggesting that they will move with all deliberate speed to get the remaining readings. This current situation has had some serious consequences. The most obvious is massive street protests and demonstrations in response to the proposals, to indicate by a show of bodies that the majority of the Israeli public does not support these proposals. I don't remember, by the way, exactly what the poll numbers are. It's not an overwhelming difference, but it is a fairly clear difference. So we've had massive street protests. This has led to responses to control them that have involved much more aggressive use of the police and the military than Israel is accustomed to. And that has led to some withdrawal of support among the military. There's been some evidence of disaffection and also some evidence of withdrawal of economic investments from Israel as a result of the trouble. There's been significant loss of support among American friends of Israel. The central problem for Americans confronted with an Israeli government that they don't approve of has been how to make clear the distinction between their support for Israel and their approval of the government. This has become more difficult as a result of these moves, and several prominent Americans have written or spoken publicly in criticism of Israel and suggesting that these acts may weaken Israel's legitimacy. Among them, I'm thinking particularly of Michael Bloomberg, and the foreign affairs columnist Thomas Friedman. And there's been heightened concern among others in America who, to start with, have had trouble distinguishing criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. And so the Israeli government action has produced an increase in anti-Semitic advocacy, at least, and an increase in complaints about anti-Semitic advocacy. Well, how's this one going to play out? There are several possibilities. The government, on its own initiative, could withdraw or modify some of its proposals. Withdrawal is unlikely, modification is possible. The government could fall because the Netanyahu coalition could have a few defections, people who are bothered by the economic consequences, or people who are bothered by the military effects, or whatever. A small number of defections could topple the current government and force new elections. Or the proposals could pass and the critics could acquiesce. Or the proposals could be withdrawn and subjected to compromise as proposed by Israel's President Herzog and the US President Biden. Or Israel could have a genuine, I'll call it a constitutional crisis, even though there's no constitution, in which the proposals pass, the Supreme Court invalidates them, which it currently has the power to do. The Supreme Court invalidates them. Netanyahu's supporters deny the authority of the court to do so, and civil strife and conflict results. And that would challenge fundamentally the character of the state of Israel. Now, there is a coda to all of this before I leave the topic, and that is how Netanyahu's personal situation plays into this. Netanyahu is under indictment for corruption. He chose not to resign the prime ministership when he was indicted. The law doesn't require him to do that, but he was expected to do it. But he didn't. And there's considerable speculation that if these proposals pass, Netanyahu would use his control of the government and the ability of the government to override the Supreme Court to pass legislation that would either invalidate the charges against him, claim that penalties could not be applied, or in some other way exonerate Netanyahu as a result of these changes in the Israeli government structure. That's enough on that topic. Let me come next to what I think is the gravest issue facing the United States domestically, and that is the debt ceiling discussion. We talked about this in January. Not much has happened since January, except that the United States reached the debt ceiling on January 19th. Why hasn't the country fallen apart, you may ask? Because the Treasury Department has the ability to move money around and jiggle this and play games with that, taking what they call extraordinary measures to stave off the consequences of the debt ceiling being reached for about 4 to 5 months. So the rubber will hit the road as early as June, and probably sometime this summer. Now, remember, at the risk of insulting your intelligence, the debt ceiling is not a limit on what can be spent. It's a limit on what can be borrowed. So the debt ceiling, to raise the debt ceiling, does not authorize new spending. It authorizes borrowing to pay for spending that has already been incurred. The total debt of the United States in 2000 was $6 trillion. Now, 23 years later, it's $31.4 trillion. 40% of that increase came during the administration of Donald Trump, and it's primarily the result of the tax cuts of 2017, for which there was no offsetting revenue although there were predictions made by the supporters of the tax cuts that they would pay for themselves. Now, there are very simple competing positions here. President Biden and his supporters claim that the debt ceiling must be increased by Congress without conditions. As Biden has pointed out, was done 3 times during the Trump administration. That's his position. He's not prepared to negotiate any deals. He insists on a clean increase in the debt ceiling. The position of the Republican Party, and particularly the Republicans in the House of Representatives, has been that they will not agree to any increase in the debt ceiling unless President Biden will agree to significant reductions in future spending. The details of the reductions have not been set forward, nor has the amount. In fact, the House Republicans recently claimed they needed more time to come up with those figures and would not have their numbers ready until later in the spring. But there is no known move toward compromise or negotiations of which I am aware. But there is broad agreement on one thing, and that is for the United States to fail to raise the debt ceiling and thereby lose the authority to borrow to pay its obligations would be absolutely catastrophic to the economy, not just of the US, but of the world. Why doesn't that trigger action? Because each side starts with that premise and uses it as a reason why in the end the other side will have to yield. And so we're hurtling toward a train wreck. And if Congress averts it, they'll do so at the last minute, as happened the last time there was one of these crises during the Obama administration in 2011. It's interesting, it appears that the Republicans in the House believe that government spending is too high whenever Democrats are in the presidency, but not when Republicans are. At least that's an inference one could make from their behavior. Now, a couple of fairly creative workarounds have been proposed. One was that Biden could order the minting of $1 trillion coin and then use a platinum coin, and then use some of them to pay down the debt that we currently have, thereby opening room to borrow again under the existing ceiling. I doubt that will happen. There is the 14th Amendment proposal. You all know your Constitution, and so you know that in the 14th Amendment, which was adopted after the Civil War, section, I believe it's 3 of that amendment, says that the public debt of the United States shall not be questioned or challenged. Now, if you think this has nothing to do with the current debt ceiling issue, you're absolutely right. It was put into the 14th Amendment to prevent the possibility that when Democrats regain power in the reconstructed southern states, that they would repudiate the debt that the US had incurred to finance the Civil War. And so to prevent that from happening, they wrote this provision into the 14th Amendment. But hey, if you're an originalist, like 6 members of the Supreme Court, and you say the original understanding of the 14th Amendment was very clear, it was to guarantee the protection of the US debt, well, then it would seem to cover this case. And if you're a textualist, like some of these same justices claim to be, the text couldn't be plainer. I doubt that's going to happen. It's never been used, that section of the 14th Amendment. It's never been used. There's no legislative history. There's no precedent. I don't think the court is going to be likely to go there. You may remember in January, I suggested that as far as I'm concerned, they ought to eliminate the very idea of the debt ceiling and simply establish that the obligation to pay bills is inherent in the act of incurring the bills, so that there wouldn't be two separate decisions to spend money and then to borrow to pay it back. But I suspect that there will be some kind of deal worked out, although I hesitate to say, because Biden has reportedly learned from his experience in the Obama administration that making a deal and lowering your sights and agreeing to cut spending is not in the best interest of the economy. A lot of economists believe that those decisions resulted in a much slower recovery from the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 than we otherwise would have had. Now, while I'm on the subject of budgets and debt, let me say a few things about the period between President Biden's State of the Union address and his budget message last week. The State of the Union address may seem to us like so long ago, but it was really in many ways a remarkable speech as a speech. Biden had been declared too old to run again, too frail, out of it. And with these messages and their underlying strategy, he regained the initiative. The strategy of the State of the Union, I think, includes these elements. First, to defend previously enacted big money legislation that had not seen its full effect yet. And this would include things like the infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, which are going to spill out benefits over the next year or so. And several times, Biden said in the State of the Union speech, we're only beginning. He claimed benefits were still to accrue, and he emphasized appeal to moderates and working class, talking about good paying jobs that don't require a college degree. He talked about how this is going to be a blue collar recovery. And this is all part of his attempt to hold on to or to recapture support from blue collar and working class Democrats. He called for the elimination of junk fees and for bargaining on drug prices as ways to lower costs for average families and thereby reduce inflation. At the same time, as he promised increased spending, he promised deficit reduction. And in his budget message, he spelled out $3 trillion of deficit reduction. And he was going to do that by increasing taxes on corporations and individuals with incomes over $400,000, both of which the Republicans oppose, but both of which are relatively popular among average voters. Meanwhile, he defended safety net programs against threatened Republican cuts, taking advantage of the Republican divisions on the issue and the heckling that he could predict he would get when he talked about preserving Social Security and Medicare intact. Referring obliquely to Senator Rick Scott of Florida, who had proposed to sunset all laws every 5 years, Biden caught on that that would include Social Security and Medicare as well until Scott changed his mind. And so he said, I don't say it's a majority, I don't say it's the official position, but there are some Republicans who want to cut or eliminate Social Security or put it on the chopping block, I forget exactly what he said, every 5 years. He's referring to one person, to Rick Scott, but his reference to some Republicans generated widespread booing and heckling among the Republicans, which Biden pivoted on and said, oh, I see you don't want to do that. And when nobody spoke up or raised their hand or made any noises, he said, well, I guess it's unanimous that they're off the table. Well, now this was not just a political point for the moment. If you take Social Security and Medicare, as well as defense, off the table, it is virtually impossible for the Republicans to achieve their stated objective of a balanced budget within 10 years without tax increases. The New York Times analysis figured out that it would require eliminating somewhere between 70 and 85% of the rest of the federal government budget, which is pretty obviously infeasible. In the budget message, Biden's strategy was to emphasize the revival of manufacturing, with reference again to good jobs that don't require a college degree. And this again is an appeal to the blue collar vote that Democrats have lost increasingly in recent years in places like Ohio. Meanwhile, to double down on increased spending for progressive social programs that generally are popular, to place a marker for $3 trillion in deficit reduction. And this puts the ball in the Republicans' court. And Biden can chuckle and smile at the fact that they've had to defer or delay the presentation of their budget because they're confronted with this terrible arithmetic problem of how they're going to achieve their goals, having exempted the parts of the budget that they've exempted. But Biden, at the same time, passed up the opportunity to discuss the serious issue with Social Security and Medicare. Medicare is predicted to become insolvent by 2028 and Social Security by 2034 if nothing is done. Now, Biden has presented a proposal for what to do, and it involves raising the income cap that's subject to Social Security taxes, plus increasing the Social Security tax rate on those over $400,000. And my guess is that Biden must have decided he had proposed enough tax increases already in his budget proposal, and that he'd get to this at another time, but there's not that much time remaining. Now, those are the topics I wanted to discuss in some depth. I want to finish up by talking briefly about 6 or 7 other topics. Number one is inflation and interest rates. Just when the Fed began to moderate the interest rate increases, inflation came back at an increased level. The Fed is meeting next week. It's unclear what they'll do. There had been projections and predictions that they would go back to raising the interest rate by 0.75%, by 75 basis points. But that was challenged in the past week with the experience of the mid-sized banks that have collapsed. And that collapse in part relates to how they responded to the interest rate increase and raises the question whether the Fed has pushed interest rates up too fast. And that leads to the second topic, bank failures. I am no economist. I don't pretend to understand this, but there are, I think, at least 2 causal drivers that are at work. One, in 2018, the Congress passed, in a somewhat bipartisan move, and President Trump signed relaxation of some of the requirements of the Dodd-Frank bill that was passed in 2010 to combat the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And it had to do with how much cash banks had to hold available for depositors to reclaim and how much they could reinvest. And the effect of the legislation was to raise the threshold for banks that would be subject to these regulations from 50, I think it was million dollars in assets to $250 million in assets. It may have been billion, I'm not sure. But the result of it was to exempt a group of mid-sized banks that had previously been subject to regulations on this matter, to exempt them from. The other causal driver is a simple economic relationship between the interest rate and the bond rate. They're inversely related. So if the interest rate goes up, bonds with a fixed interest rate are less attractive to invest in. And so when the interest rate goes up, bonds become cheaper. And so if you hold on to your bonds, you don't have enough bonds when they're called or when you need to sell them. You have to sell them too cheaply. If you let go of them, you're selling them. You're predicting that the bond rate will stay down. And so if this happens quickly, you can end up with insufficient liquidity because you've converted your bonds at cheaper levels than you would have had the interest rate not gone up. If that makes sense to you, you're better than I. But the point of it is that acts as a brake on the Federal Reserve decision about how much to raise the interest rates. And the response to the banks, to the few banks failing, on the one hand, is the president and the secretary of the Treasury and others in the administration, I think with good reason, reassuring the American public that the banking system is fundamentally sound and thus foregoing a run on the banks, while at the same time playing the blame game, where it seemed that Biden was quite quick to blame Trump personally for these failures, even though the legislation in question had significant Democratic support as well as Republican. Next topic, the war in Ukraine. This is, of course, a major issue, a major topic, and yet it seems like not much has happened since the last time we talked about it, except that more people have been killed, injured, more property has been damaged. Right now, there have been continuing attacks by both sides without significant gains. The fighting now centers around Bakhmut, which is a mostly depopulated town in eastern Ukraine, but a key spot for Russian resupply of its forces. Russia had the town nearly encircled and Ukraine considered evacuation, but decided against it, decided to try to hold its ground in Bakhmut and tie the Russians down, which at the very least would put them in a weaker position to mount their anticipated spring offensive. Meanwhile, Ukraine is buying time for the arrival of the German Leopard tanks, which have been promised, which would give it a big advantage. Next, the China balloon incident. A surveillance balloon was discovered in US airspace. It was shot down, but not until it had traveled across the United States and was out over the Atlantic Ocean. Republicans criticized this delay by saying that valuable surveillance data was lost, but that doesn't appear to have been the case because it was encrypted data. 3 other balloons were discovered and shot down. It appears that these 3 were not surveillance balloons, and they were shot out of an abundance of caution. And they raised the question, is the US overreacting? And is Canada overreacting when it shot one? It's unclear what the case is. More generally, Xi Jinping's consolidation of power. He was unanimously elected to an unprecedented 3rd presidential term. He installed personal loyalists in key leadership positions, and he achieved a key victory last week in facilitating the reestablishment of normal diplomatic relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia, who had broken off diplomatic relations and were supporting as proxies competing sides in the civil war going on in Yemen. Now, Saudi Arabia has been a strong ally of the US, and this action doesn't disrupt it, but it gives the Saudis additional options, and it suggests that the Chinese are a force to be reckoned with in international diplomacy, and that the US may have been distracted by its strong focus on the war in Ukraine from paying enough attention to what China is up to, other than imposing trade sanctions to hurt the economy. Next topic, the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. I cannot figure this out. Is it an environmental catastrophe? Is it the result of industrial greed or corruption? Is it a minor nuisance? What's the significance of Norfolk Southern having multiple trains derail? All of this is unfolding as we speak. The EPA has just yesterday decided to test the drinking water, which previously had been pronounced safe, but many of the residents don't believe it. And we'll have to watch as that situation unfolds. And the last topic in this list that I'll cover very briefly, Vice President Pence's remarks about Donald Trump at the Gridiron Dinner last weekend. The Gridiron Dinner is an annual event with public officials of the federal government and the press, and it's mostly lighthearted. Joking around. My favorite example goes back to 1960, when in his speech, Senator Kennedy suggested that Cardinal Spellman could mediate between two people who were so divided in politics, Vice President Nixon and Governor Rockefeller. But Pence did not follow the rules of the genre at all. He did not give a lighthearted speech. He gave a speech in which he said that Trump was responsible for the rioting at the Capitol on January 6th and for threatening or putting Pence's own life in jeopardy. This speech attracted little notice, despite its historical significance and genre-bending nature of the remarks versus the expectations. And that's a disappointing sign about how much we have normalized civil violence and political violence in our contemporary US politics. But the last few times I've spoken with you, I've been urged to provide some happy news. So I want to end on a positive note. Northwestern is in the NCAA basketball tournament for the second time in program history and will open up tomorrow at 6:35 p.m. Central against Boise State. Northwestern is the 7th seed in the West Division. Boise State is the 10th, and all Northwestern fans are hoping for a win. And with that, let me stop my remarks. As I usually do, I've gone on longer than I planned, and invite Marcy to moderate. I've said Q&A, but we don't have to limit it to questions. I would welcome comments, discussion, arguments, but the floor is open.
Thank you, David. Please feel free to put up your Zoom hand or to wave to us. We'll start with Mark and Barbara. I'm not sure which one, and then Ted Goldsmith.
David, an important nuance with the Israeli judicial review is this. As you know, Israel has what are called its basic laws, which are quasi-constitutional, and other laws cannot contradict them. They're passed by a majority in the Knesset, but cannot be changed except by a 2/3 vote. So the right-wing religious and settler movement game is get rid of judicial review, pass extremist basic laws by a majority, but that can't be changed except by a 2/3 vote, and block democracy in Israel from changing them because the polls show a majority of Israelis oppose these proposed laws.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I didn't speak to that specifically, but it's a very important aspect of the situation of what could and probably would happen if judicial review goes out.
Thank you. Ted, do you want to jump in?
I have a question about, and I know you're not necessarily a China expert, but I'm getting nervous about the whole Taiwan issue. Granted, given that, you know, we have come to the aid of the Ukrainians, obviously, which I agree with, but we don't even have a legal treaty such as that. Now, but in the case of Taiwan, it's my understanding that we have sort of, I don't know if there's a written declaration, but we seem to every once in a while kind of mumble that we will protect Taiwan. And it seems to me that that's a pretty scary idea, that China, being 50 miles away or whatever, could simply, overwhelm Taiwan. And what would we do? Do you have any clue? I mean, it's frightening to think about.
Well, the official policy of the US, going back to when we withdrew diplomatic recognition from Taiwan and extended it to mainland China, the official position of the US is to be ambiguous about what we would do. And the thinking is that if we didn't make clear what we would do, that would deter China from attacking Taiwan or Taiwan from trying to reclaim mainland China. And that policy goes back to the 1970s. Now, President Biden, on a few occasions, has ad-libbed that we would come to Taiwan's defense with whatever was needed. And then the State Department or the White House follows up with a statement that says there's been no change in our official policy, and somehow Biden's statement can be reconciled with it. I think the way you've characterized our not quite saying what we would do is pretty accurate. And the question is whether that helps or hurts us. Certainly the potential is there to become embroiled in a major conflict with China if China attempts to recapture Taiwan. Now, what China has been doing is making a nuisance of itself, coming close to direct threats to Taiwan without quite making them. So they'll have military exercises nearby, or they'll surveil ships in the China Sea, and so on. And we've done the same by holding military exercises very close to Taiwan. So, I mean, there are potentially very large dangers in all of that.
It seems to me that the advantage is on the Chinese side. That's why I worry about it. I mean, they're so close, and they almost seem like they have not a lot to lose. That they can gamble that we're not going to sacrifice World War III over Taiwan.
Well, that would be their gamble.
Oh, sorry, Carl and then Jerry.
Carl, you're muted.
Carl, you have to unmute.
The event yesterday when the Russian jets hit one of our drones over the Black Sea. I mean, I think there will be lots of repercussions from that. They're so far downplaying it as having been an accident caused by a negligent and stupid pilot. But I think we'll hear a lot more of that. I recognize you haven't had time to really digest it yet.
No, I haven't. But I think you're right that there'll be more repercussions than just calling it an accident.
Jerry, do you want to jump in? And then I have a question from Paul Greenberger.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, David, again. Too much in the pot. I don't know how you compress it in 30, 40 minutes, but so many topics of interest. And I do want to follow up on Ted's question about China. I think that things are quite different now than they were a number of years ago. The strength of the Taiwanese or China lobby in Congress and among the Republicans is long gone, the influence that was there. Additionally, the Republican Party, at least some of its current leaders in Congress, are rather outspoken about intervention, contrary to the way they've been in the past. Liberation of communist dominated countries, that's rhetoric seems to be pretty much muted in the Republican Party. And while we have gone to the defense of Ukraine, we've done so in large part with the assistance of a united Europe. There is no united alliance, there's no grand alliance for our opposition to China, mainland China's intervention, ultimate, I believe, long game intervention to take over Taiwan, which we diplomatically recognize as part of one China. So I think that China is playing a long game here, and the circumstances are quite different unless the Republican hawks want to shift their position again. You did not have time today to cover the events of last week with CPAP, but I think that's kind of interesting and might be worthy of some comment if we have the time. Finally, I'd like to make a quick addendum to your observations with regard to Biden's State of the Union speech. I think that, as you pointed out on substance, he was quite good. And he did address a number of very important points. But to me, even more important than the substance was the optics. People tuned into that State of the Union to see whether he was going to stumble and mumble. Instead, he gave a very fine, at least in my view, it'd be helpful to hear your comments and others from the rhetoric point of view. But it seemed to me he gave a masterful performance, performed, and he spoke his lines correctly. He had the right timing. He gave the optical appearance of somebody who was not, too old to be in office. In fact, he seemed to be more alert than many others that were sitting there listening to him. But I think that as much as the substance was of importance, I think to many people, the optics were even more important. So again, any comments on these or other matters? Appreciate it.
Well, I would agree with you about the optics of the State of the Union speech. And that was a speech that was well practiced and well rehearsed, despite the large number of ad libs that it contained. It, at least in the short run, put to rest the question about his age and competence and ability, although those questions have been raised since. I mean, they're not put to sleep forever. But for the purposes of that speech and what a single speech could accomplish, I think you're absolutely right. You're also right in talking about the considerable change in the Republican position about intervention in other nations, both China and Europe, which has been largely reversed from what it was in the 1950s, when the central premise was that Truman had somehow lost China because mainland China had gone to the communists. I wonder, Jerry, if you mentioned briefly the CPAC conference. I think you said CPAC and not CPAP. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you were thinking about CPAC.
Well, you're right. I did misspeak. I called it CPAP because I was just adjusting my sleep machine this evening. So maybe that was on my mind. But in any event, I found it very interesting. And of course, everything's fluid. I think any of us would be a fool to predict who nominees are going to be at this early stage. That's an ebb and flow. But I did think it was interesting who spoke and who declined to speak and who even declined to show up. Even Fox had difficulty editing out the empty seats, of which there were many compared to prior years. You did not have Trump say afterwards that this was the largest attendance at any CPAC event like he did with his inauguration. I think even he had to acknowledge that attendance was down. There's a number of candidates out there and a number who have just decided to stay away from this event because I think they're recognizing that it's become a little bit too fringed even for them. So those were my initial observations on the CPAC. I'm surprised some people didn't show up wearing horns and war paint and other things as they are wont to do.
It's also a sign of the somewhat troubled position that Trump is in, where numerically, he's still got more support than any other Republican for the nomination, but his stock seems to be fading. And part of that is people absented themselves from CPAC because they didn't want to be identified with Trump or seen with it. And that's something different from what we've seen before.
And as you say, it's an indication of difficulty Trump is in, but I think it's also a very significant indication of the difficulty the Republican Party will remain in as long as a significant amount of them stay in that same wagon as Trump is pulling.
Right.
Thank you. Thank you, Jerry. We have in the chat, I have a question from Paul Greenberger, and then we'll come up to Bob. Thanks for another outstanding presentation. Does Israel benefit or not from allowing pro-Russian oligarchs, such as from Moldova, to remain in Israel? In other words, can Israel navigate the path between support for Russia instead of Ukraine?
That's a tough question. I mean, Israel has been in a relatively neutral position with respect to the war in Ukraine. They have not broken from Russia to the degree that many of the Western nations have. And I think that's because they have economic ties with Russia that may be greater than some of the other nations. So to the question, can they navigate this tension? I don't know. I mean, it's a difficult one. I understand why they're in the position that they're in, and they wouldn't necessarily help themselves by expelling these people either.
Thank you. Paul, did you want to comment on any more of that?
No, it's a tough situation. I just wanted to bring it up because and David, thanks again for preparing for this presentation.
Oh, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Bob?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk more about, I'm not really worried about the budget. However, I am worried about the banking system. Silicon Valley Bank was a case study on how not to run a bank. They did asset-based lending on illiquid securities. They took all their money and they did buy bonds, but they bought long-term bonds. And when interest rates go up, you're going to lose money. And they're not the only bank that did it. Signature Bank was doing lending on crypto. I'm sure there are other banks that are doing it. If they're well-run banks, what you try to do is you match your loans to duration, and you try to keep your duration short, where your bond fluctuation's not going to move. Now, I'm not blaming actually Congress or anybody else. I will blame, though, the bank regulators and the Federal Reserve. They're supposed to be watching these people. And even tonight, Switzerland kind of bailed out Credit Suisse, who, some of the foreign banks have problems also. So this isn't a one-up case of what's going on. And hopefully some of the other smaller banks, are being well run and matching maturities and keeping because all the money that banks take in, they buy government bonds, they buy good bonds. But if they're buying maturities, their portfolios are way underwater. And when the government says the taxpayer's not going to pay a penny, I don't believe them.
Well, that kind of depends on what the size of the problem turns out to be.
Yeah,
I mean, the government, as is its interest, is emphasizing that this is a small number of banks and it's a self-contained problem. That may or may not be the case. And how that turns out will determine how warranted your worries are.
well, the Fed's not going to raise, if they raise, they're going to do 25 basis points and they're done because they can't raise it anymore. They might raise it to save face one more time and that's it, at least in my humble opinion.
But then the question is, what if any other inflation control measures do you have?
Well, then it's a case of what really does cause inflation. So
Right.
that's debatable too. There's a war in Ukraine, and I remember from Vietnam that caused all the inflation of the 1970s. So that's part of it. And how much is inflation caused by COVID? How much of it's caused by human nature? Of all of a sudden, we're left out of being inside for 2 or 3 years, and now we're kind of set free. So the one constant thing in human nature never changes. So that's just my opinion. So
Well, and that's coupled with a reluctance bordering on unwillingness to raise the money to pay for it.
that's true.
I mean, the size of the deficits is also an issue.
Thanks, Bob. Anybody else waving or putting up a electronic hand here? Or unmute yourself in case I'm not seeing you.
Al Erlbacher.
You have to just unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
The one person on the conservative side in the Republican Party who have not heard anything, at least I have not heard anything from, is Lynn Cheney. Do you think there's any chance that she might launch an active campaign?
Do you mean Lynn Cheney or Liz Cheney?
I'm sorry, Liz Cheney, pardon me. No,
Well,
the
there's
Congresswoman, the former Congresswoman from Wyoming.
right, Liz Cheney. It's always possible, but it's hard for me to imagine from what base she would do it.
Yeah.
I mean, she has the same issue in the Republican Party as Pete Buttigieg does in the Democratic Party of having a weak base. I mean, Buttigieg couldn't run for anything from Indiana, which is why he has changed his residence to Michigan. I think Cheney would have to do something similar to get a base other than Wyoming to run from. It's one of the things that it's too early to tell yet is whether there will be a lot of candidates in the Republican Party or whether a number of these prospective candidates will decide not to run. It's in Trump's interest to have as many opponents as possible within the Republican Party because the Republican primaries are almost all winner take all.
Right.
So that he could win them with very small percentages. So I think his game is to encourage everybody who's thinking about running to run. And I think the alternative will be some self-denial decisions on the part of some of the prospective Republican candidates. And my guess is that Liz Cheney would be one of those, but I don't know.
Thank you.
Sure.
Just scanning again in case somebody has a thought, a comment here. Jerry, Nancy? Are you raising your hand still?
Yeah, I raised it again, in the absence of anybody else raising it. David, you mentioned, one of Biden's proposals, with regard to, raising revenue had to do with lifting the ceiling on the, Medicare income, levels, Social Security levels. I think, that's a good idea. Do you have any comment with regard to the other proposal, which is to increase the cap on the Medicare Part D tax component? I think there's a tremendous source of income there, and the opposition to having people over $400,000 still be required to contribute to Medicare Part D funding, I don't think there'd be that much opposition. Any comments from you? And this panel of people with us, I think all of us, not trying to insult anybody, I think all of us would be on Medicare or eligible, so we would have a definite immediate interest in protecting the Medicare fund.
Well, I'm not an expert on Part D. For basic Medicare, there is no income limit. That's the difference between Medicare and Social Security. Now, Part D is prescription drug coverage. And I don't know the details of how it works.
No, what I meant is your Social Security tax, your FICA tax.
Right.
There's caps on that, and
Yes.
there are caps on the tax that you also pay for Part D, which is a much lower percentage. And that's currently, unless somebody corrects me, I think that's currently capped at 400,000. And the idea is to extend that tax on all of your income above 400,000, just like it is for anybody who earns less than 400,000. Your entire income is subject to that tax.
Well, I mean, assuming that the facts are what you state, I would agree with you that that would be a relatively uncontroversial proposal.
Thanks. I think Paul has another comment question.
This, David, this would be to put on the agenda maybe for the future, but this brings up the issue of governing, I guess, in rapid time or current time, where it's not clear there are any kind of debates over what the policy should be, whether it's funding Medicare, Social Security, this and that. It seems like things are held, they're just held hostage, and then there's decisions at the end. But I don't know if things are worse now, let's say the last 5 or 10 years, whether it's worse compared to history or not. But at some point, I'd like you to maybe talk about, let's say, what you see as the result of this kind of, to me, wait to the last minute, but not really have a substantive discussion.
Well, and it means that Congress doesn't deliberate.
I know.
You
It
get these
doesn't, I
big-
don't know if they do, but it seems like they don't. And I think that might be hurting our country.
Yeah, I have to give that some thought.
Thank you.
Thoughts, and David, for sure, if you have other thoughts that you want to bring forth to us after the comments have come to you.
I'm about out of thoughts, but I'll replenish my supply by May the 24th, which is the next one of these sessions.
We're delighted that there is another one.
We'll
Yeah,
see if there's any better news.
thank you very much for this evening. I think the interest and the faces speak for themselves. We're
My
very
pleasure. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David,
Thank you, David.
For a
Thank you.
thorough report.
Go Northwestern.
There you go.
And maybe that'll be the good news. They'll be national champs.
I wouldn't bet on it.
No, I wouldn't either. Let's
I
hope
hope
they
they
make
get
it
past
past
the
the
first
round.
round.
Yeah, that would be nice.
Neither do the bookies.
Probably get some good odds.
I think you would get better odds of Donald Trump producing Barack Obama's non-Hawaiian birth records than Northwestern winning the whole thing.
You never know. You never know.
You
I know-
spoiled my fun.
Produce it.
Well, at least they're going to get a couple players drafted in the NFL, so 2 or 3 of them. So the lineman was going to go in the first round, maybe the other guy, and your running back will probably be a 4th or 5th round pick. So in football, even though they didn't have a good team.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you,
Sure.
Stay
David.
safe, everybody.
Take care, everybody. Be healthy.
Thank you, Marcy.
Sure.